Well, board members, good morning, Thomas and Laverne, Lori, and Ozzy. I'm glad we can all be here, although not all in person, but I'm happy that we can all participate today. I'm going to just say a few remarks and then turn it over to General Manager DeSue. Today, the whole purpose of today's meeting is to reflect on where we are in terms of the direction the board gave the general manager and staff last November, understand where we are with the Title VI, and then talk about future directions having to do with fare increase for the agency. And with that as a purpose of what we're here today, I'm going to turn it over to General Manager DeSue for his comments, and then to begin the presentation. You'll have some of it will be a review of what we've seen before to kind of create the context of where the agency is fiscally. General Manager DeSue.
Thanks, President Simmons. Good morning, board members. I see everyone virtually there. Good morning to all of you. Thank you all for being here this morning. Today's discussion is a very important one. As we begin this morning, I want to touch on how we've reached today and how the current fare increase proposal, which the board will consider in April and vote on in May, came about. Last October, TriMet staff came before the board during a strategy session to report on our strategic financial role of ridership and fares in the financial health of TriMet. As I said at that time, in order for TriMet to succeed, we must have financial stability, which can only be accomplished through sustainable budgeting and asset management replacement. Having a sustainable budget to consistently deliver safe, reliable transit and uninterrupted maintenance that our region needs. At the end of that session, we were directed to come back before the board with a proposal and rationale for updating our fare structure. During the board's November 9th retreat, TriMet staff did just that. Our CFO, Executive Director of Finance and Administrative Services, Nancy Young-Oliver, laid out scenarios of what fare increases might look like, with several dates and increased amounts described for discussion purposes. During that discussion, all board members cited the need for TriMet to increase fare revenue and overall revenue to provide financial sustainability for our transit operations, as well as address the inflationary increases and the cost of operating the transit system. A straw poll of board members was taken, and the board directed TriMet staff to develop a one-time fare increase for January 2024. TriMet then launched a public engagement and outreach campaign from December 8th, 2022 through February 25th, 2023, this year, to gather rider, employee, and public feedback on the proposed fare increase. Just last week at the March board meeting, you heard a recap of that feedback. That brings us to today. You will hear an update on the financial outlook with the fare increase and get a preliminary look at the Title VI analysis and mitigations that was conducted. Based on any final feedback from you today, staff will put together the formal fare increase ordinance, which will have a first reading and a public hearing at the board's April 26th meeting. The second reading and vote will be at your May 24th board meeting. Now I'd like to turn it over to our CFO, Nancy Young-Oliver, to discuss our financial overview and our fare proposal. Nancy.
Good morning, President Simmons and members of the board. We met with you in November and provided you information on the role that fares play in TriMet's financial sustainability And today, we will further that conversation, starting with a look at total resources compared to system and operating costs. The slide before you captures both revenues and requirements. The colored bars represent TriMet's major resource categories compared to operating and system costs represented in the blue and purple lines, respectively. The resources include passenger fares, employer payroll taxes, operating grants that include STIF, Lyft, and other operating revenues such as advertising and federal stimulus funding. This slide demonstrates that TriMet's major sources of revenue, with the exception of passenger fares, have continued to increase every year for the past decade. Passenger fares have not kept pace with the increases in our operating costs. Fiscal year 2019 was the first year that total resources did not keep pace with our system requirements, which is also the timing of when staff had initial discussions of possible future year deficits. The stimulus funds TriMet started receiving in 2020 have sustained the agency with the necessary funding to meet its obligations, allowing us not to lay off staff and to only take minimal cuts in the services provided. However, that stimulus funding is a one-time only funding source, and we will have depleted those funds by the end of fiscal year 2024. In May of 2022, we presented to you that after 2029, TriMet will be forced to address financial shortfalls. With both a very optimistic projection of the employer payroll tax combined with the proposed fare increase, TriMet may be able to kick that can down a few years beyond fiscal 2029. However, without the fare increase, we will face that shortfall 1 to 1.5 years prior. In the previous strategy meeting, we heard questions around the different revenue sources and whether TriMet has looked to all possible revenue streams for additional funding. The graph displayed summarizes the continuing revenues. That includes funding from our business community in TriMet's footprint, federal formula funding, state payroll taxes, state and local operating grants, and other sources of continuing revenues such as advertising and the sale of clean fuel credits. What is not included, but is pivotal to TriMet's ability to deliver the services and infrastructure required, is how well TriMet staff have been in shaking the couch cushions for additional funding. Since 2014, TriMet has been awarded almost $1.2 billion in discretionary competitive funding. That's $1.2 billion. Those funds have been dedicated to capital projects, including the Red Line, positive train control, fixed route buses, division transit, Forward Together, operator safety and rider awareness, and other projects. While TriMet has a grants team dedicated to identifying and locking in those competitive grant opportunities, the business community through its employer payroll tax, employees through the employee payroll tax, federal, state, and local governments have all increased funding to TriMet year over year. The one source that has not increased in kind is the passenger fares. Also competing for funding is TriMet's State of Good Repair initiatives. With an aging infrastructure, additional funding will be required beyond what's currently forecasted if we are to meet the federal requirements. We currently forecast $30 million in general funding annually for the State of Good Repair. If TriMet were to forecast funding for State of Good Repair at $80 million, our financial forecast cliff would move closer by 3 years. The optimum funding for State of Good Repair is upwards of $235 million per year for the next 20 years. If we were to forecast based on that projection, our financial cliff would hit in fiscal year 2026. That assumes, though, that some of those expenses could also be covered with discretionary funding. Just want to pause here, see if there's any questions or comments.
I'm checking to see if any of the board members have any questions. Ozzy, Director Gonzalez.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay,
Yes.
first of all?
Yeah.
Sound check. I see him. Okay. Thank you, Nancy, for this overview. Could you say of what you think has led to the change in the proportion between operating cost total system cost since 2010. It seems as though those lines are getting farther, and in 2010, system operations were about just under 75% of overall, where it looks closer now to just above 50%. So is this something, can you please help us understand that?
Yes, Director Gonzalez, I do have a slide coming up talking about specific system expansions that we've made, but just to touch, is a combination of both inflation and increases in service and all the expansions and enhancements that we've made in the system.
I'm looking to see if there are any other questions or comments. Director Way?
Thanks. I do have a question. So with the bar chart that we're seeing on slide 2, I think my assumption is that passenger fares and the decrease is also related to ridership, right? Obviously,
Yes.
Pandemic happened, there were just less riders in our system. So how would ridership play into this equation moving forward? Is there a plan to increase ridership to again make up for some of the lost revenue?
Director Wade, that's a great question, and yes. If you have had the opportunity to review our business plan, we have a number of initiatives specifically targeted on increasing ridership, and I know that JC is here and could speak more specifically to those initiatives.
Thank you. I'm just worried that if we were to go with the fare increase this spring and we're still not seeing ridership numbers go up, but see this kind of stagnated line, wouldn't that defeat the purpose, right, of increasing fares? So
I appreciate the question. So it's not just about increasing the fares and bringing the ridership back. That is absolutely pivotal to increasing the fare revenues overall. But we have ongoing operating costs and responsibilities to maintaining our system that requires additional funding.
the additional funding from fares.
Yes.
Okay. And then the 2014 discretionary funding, I think you said the 1.9 billion.
1.2.
1.2 billion. So how much of that have we spent down, and how much do we have left over?
That has been fully utilized
Okay,
within our system.
great. So that funding is null. We don't have that anymore.
Correct.
Okay.
And again, we continue to pursue all of those discretionary competitive grants.
Okay.
Director Edwards.
Thank you. I have a concern, and I think it's really comes back to the board, because I don't think we gave you all the parameters or had you look at everything that we should be looking at in regard to a fare increase. And when I say that, I think that perhaps, and we've had some testimony to that, about restructuring our system in regards to who pays what and how much they pay. And I think that that's something that should be explored as well before we get to this final fare increase, because that will allow us to still increase the fare, but it won't be so burdensome on folks that are either low income or seniors or folks that are have mobility issues as well. And I think those should be some considerations that we look at in regards to our fare increase. So it's just not a blanket fare increase, because our customer base is not just everybody didn't fit into that same box.
Yeah. Director Edwards, I believe that John's presentation is going to address those concerns.
Director Bauman.
Yes, thank you. I had Nancy, I just wonder if you could recap. I believe you said that in 2029, current projections are that there would be a shortfall in 2029. With a fare increase, that will be delayed for a few years. You said without it. So, go ahead.
I was going to say, with a combination of a very optimistic view of the strength of our employer payroll tax combined with the fare increase, we can push that out several years.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to be sure I had that. And then you said without a fare increase. Well, tell me what the 2029 shortfall, what the assumptions are there.
Yeah, so with the optimistic view of our employer payroll tax combined with the increase in the fares, we will be able to push out the financial cliff a couple years. If we don't include a fare increase, then that backs that up a year to a year and a half.
Okay, thank you.
Seeing no other questions, we can move on to the next slide.
Great. So as we look to the operating costs, passenger revenues, and the fare box recovery ratio, we see that the fare box recovery ratio experienced growth through fiscal year 2014, but started to decline in 2015, well before the pandemic. The fare box recovery ratio was just under 40% in 2014, but dropped to approximately 26% just prior to the pandemic. The fare box recovery ratio is affected by the level of ridership, but also directly impacted by the fact that the costs have increased year over year. As a result of the pandemic, the fare box recovery ratio reached an all-time low of 9.9% in fiscal year 2021. 2022 ended at 13.3%, and current to date in fiscal 2023, we're at 12.5%. The average annual increase in operating costs is 4.2% prior to the pandemic and has remained flat since the pandemic due to significant cost-cutting measures that management implemented. Also during this 10-year span, it's important to note that TriMet increased the transfer time from 2 hours to 2.5 hours. We expanded the low-income fare program and implemented that student fare program. We implemented the HOP Fast Pass with fare capping, yet we've implemented multiple service expansions and safety and security investments. Okay.
Does the board have any questions on this particular slide? Seeing none, we can proceed. Oh, I'm
I
sorry.
had a question, pardon me.
You know, I can't see you because John is right in your way. I know, I see John, so maybe you should tap John on the shoulder when you want to
John.
talk. Now I can't see Laverne. Yes, Director Gonzalez. You have the floor. Yes.
Thank you, President Simmons. Thank you, President Simmons. A question here on fare box recovery ratio. To what extent are you evasion in this current ratio, and any changes? Are you factoring any changes to fare evasion rates as we move forward in the forecast?
I think I heard the question. So do we have any consideration in the financial forecast for fare evasion? Is that correct?
Yeah, and do you factor any changes to fare evasion rates over time?
Okay. So within our financial forecast, we do multiple scenarios. And included in those scenarios are increases in our ridership, considering the removal of fare evasion to different levels, as well as a baseline of where we're at today.
And are you forecasting a reduction in fare evasion rates? I'm operating under the assumption that our new safety and security team are going to help in this. So if you're seeing that reduction.
Yes.
Okay, we'll move forward.
Thank you. So operating costs, as displayed in the green bar, continues to climb on an average of 4.2% annually, whereas our passenger revenues, the blue bar, has not kept pace. The red line demonstrates the percentage change in our base fares from fiscal year 2010 to fiscal year 2022. The total percentage change since fiscal year 2010 demonstrates that TriMet's pricing strategy has not kept pace with the increase in operating costs, and TriMet is now operating at a fair deficit, not just due to inflation, but due to the increases in service and our infrastructure enhancements.
Next slide.
Okay. As we look at a snapshot of our peer fares, it demonstrates that first, TriMet is lagging behind in the adult base of many of its peers. And second, TriMet's daily ticket price displayed in the far right column is well below those of our peers, from 17 to as much as 55%.
Yes, Director Way.
I'm sorry, can I make just a quick comment on that? So I know that in our proposal, there's an effect on youth pass as well. And I think it would be helpful, because right now the adult is just outlined, but maybe moving forward, for educational purposes, it would just be helpful if any of these other cities are also, what are their efforts around serving youth, high school students, et cetera, and then our snapshot as we currently have it.
Okay.
Director Edwards?
Yes, I had a question on this snapshot of peer fares. Do we have also a comparison of what their ridership looks like?
We can certainly provide that to you.
Yes, that would be very helpful if we had that, so we can have a full comparison.
Okay.
Okay. And we can provide that probably, at the next board meeting,
Yep.
or even maybe before then, we can send it out.
Yes. All right. So looking at the average annual inflation over the past decade, fuel costs have increased on average 2.4%. So in fiscal year 2012, fuel was $3.40 a gallon, and in 2022, $4.31 a gallon, an overall increase of 27% since 2012. Food has increased on average 3.1%. Your food bill in 2012 of $100 now costs you $135.19, an overall increase of 35% since 2012. Electricity has increased 3.6%. A $50 electric bill in 2012 now costs $70.98, an overall increase of 42% since 2012. However, the TriMet adult ticket in 2012 was $2.50 and remains the same since 2012, experiencing a 0% increase over the decade. Had TriMet increased fares at any time during this past decade by 30 cents, our average annual increase would be 1.1%, with an overall increase of 12%. The proposed fare increase is less than half the fuel increase and 3 times less than the increase in food and electricity. Had TriMet applied a 2% annual increase over the past decade, then the adult fare today would be $3.05. During the past decade, TriMet has been busy with system expansion and innovations, including adding and restoring frequent service in both bus and MAX, service enhancements, system reliability, express service, light rail extensions, adding electric buses and the corresponding infrastructure, along with our digital tools. At the time that TriMet was making these extensive system expansions, adding approximately $32 million annually to our operating costs, TriMet also eased the burden to our riders when we implemented the HOP pass with fare capping, along with a highly subsidized low-income fare program and student pass program. My final slide today is to highlight a portion of our strategic financial plan policy that was adopted by the board in December of 2019. The policy addresses TriMet's fare policy, calling for a financially sustainable system that balances growth in both ridership and passenger revenue, specifically by maintaining a pricing strategy that keeps pace with the cost of service. The fare proposal that you will vote on in May is needed in order for TriMet to meet the responsibilities for a financially sustainable system. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Let's have the virtual participants. I can't see Director Bauman. Could we have Director Baum? Okay. So I'm looking to see at this point in the information, what additional questions the board might have before we move into the next part of our presentation, which has to do with the Title VI. Director Edwards.
Are we going to have something today about safety and security as well? How the increased costs that we've had in that to compare it, because there's some outside influences that have impacted us, and we've had to respond to that.
Yes, actually, that could have been in the last slide in terms of what we've had to do to respond to the environment in which transit is providing service in the community, and the increased vandalism and crime that has been taking place on the system. That's true.
Yeah.
I don't think we had planned to present anything other than what we've presented at the board meeting in terms of the additional positions that the agency has acquired in order to ensure transit riders that the system is safe. But that is an additional cost that we've experienced, and I think at the last board meeting, maybe it is delayed until the April board meeting. I mean, the agency's experienced tremendous vandalism that has resulted in huge increases in property improvements as well as vehicles and also assaults on staff. So let me see if there are any other comments. Director Gonzalez?
Thank you, President Quinn. Just for us to be on the same page for the record, I was hoping if you could please just what is the and what are at the different levels, what are people paying? I'll ask one question at a time. So what is the cap current?
Oh, the cap. What is the cap?
The fare cap.
The fare cap.
Our current fare cap on the daily is
riders.
$5.
Uh-huh. And what do you have to do to get to that cap? How often do you have to ride?
I'm sorry.
Oh,
You cut out. Can you say that again?
twice.
Okay.
Yes, to get to the fare cap, yes, you're going to be riding twice during the day. So once in the morning, once in the evening.
Okay.
Is there a monthly cap?
So that's the daily cap. The monthly cap is $28 for honored citizens. Okay.
And is there a monthly cap for adults?
100.
Thank you. It's 100 for adults. But that's for a month of unlimited rides.
Yes.
Yes. Now, Director Gonzalez, did you have a second
Thank you.
question?
And the low income fare,
Low.
what is that currently once a person has enrolled in the program?
Is there a cap for a low-income fare?
Yeah.
It's $28.
And the daily pass for a ride?
For low-income fare is right now $1.20.
So the fare is $2.50 for a ride, but 50% of that is subsidized.
It's for low-income fare, yeah. So it is $1.25 for low-income fare and
Yes.
honored citizens.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, for 2.5 hours, and then $2.50 for a day.
Yeah, and $2.50 for
for a
the
day.
full day.
Okay.
Yeah.
Director Way has a question, and then we'll come back to you, Director Gonzalez, if you have additional questions.
So my sort of, I guess, statement or question was around the last slide, when we're looking at our fare policy. And I guess the part that I'm still hung up on a little bit is the supporting the ridership piece and increasing that base post-pandemic. And I think with the current proposal that we have, it's increasing fares, right, on various groups. And what I'm I'm trying to connect the dots here because the riders that we're currently seeing that we've seen sustain TriMet even through the pandemic, are a lot of the frontline workers, are a lot of low-income folks. They're transit dependent. There are people with disabilities who, because they have no other choice, are going to continue to keep riding TriMet. And I would even say if the fare increase were even to happen, they would still pay the increase and they would still keep riding. So that's not the population for me that I'm worried about in terms of those ridership numbers going up, because I think they are going to continue to go up and sustain our organization financially. My question is around what are we doing to increase ridership in the downtown business core, where we see these office buildings that are, quite frankly, they're empty now, right? People are working from home. So there's a part of an equation here of how do we continue to increase ridership? Because that's the lifeline of transit, is seeing these buses full, seeing the maxes full. And I just feel like as an observer, they're empty a lot of times, to nobody's fault. I mean, the pandemic really rocked a lot of things. But how are we talking to businesses about, hey, how do we get your 300, 400 employees back onto our transit system?
So Director Way, there's two very important pieces to what you're talking about that TriMet has no control over. One is does a business continue to operate in downtown Portland? That's outside of our control. And second is, when is the employer going to increase the return to in-person work for the remaining businesses? So that's definitely has an impact on TriMet, and I'll let JC speak to efforts.
Just a point I wanted to make as well, the effort that the agency has done to look at new travel patterns through the Forward Together initiative and changing bus routes. Every agency in the country that has done that has resulted in significant increases in ridership. And so the most recent first reading of a resolution for improvements in September is we're going to start seeing the fruits of some of the changes in our routes. So I wanted to draw that correlation between route changes and understanding that because people are working from home and maybe not coming into the downtown, transit has an obligation to see where people need to go and then adjust to make it possible for them to get there on transit.
I appreciate that comment, President Simmons, and I guess my point is exactly that, is that those populations are the ones that are going to continue to use our service, but those are also the ones that I think maybe we'll find out more in the equity analysis. They more oftentimes are people of color, transit dependent, folks with disabilities, and are low income. So again, I'm not concerned about those ridership numbers because we know that service is going to continue to help them and even enhance them with the Forward Together plan. My question and my comment was around our other strategies of increasing ridership among people who are middle, higher income. Again, like, folks that I know who used to work downtown in a thriving downtown, take transit regularly, maybe has a car or two at home, but because they work downtown, they're just no longer here. And I know that some of it is out of our control, but I do push back. I think it is part of our job. I think that is part of our outreach plan, is how do we work with businesses to make sure that public transit can become their number one choice when they go to work.
Amen. There's so many strings on this, or layers of this onion to pull back. I would say first and foremost is that our community is still going through a lot of stuff right now, and we're still trying to figure it out as a community, and we're working very hard and with our partners. I will say this, there are days where our own safety and security is doing so much on our system, and it's really us working to get that story out. Just yesterday, Andrew Wilson and folks from my team met with the federal government, who have 7,000 employees that they normally bring to downtown Portland. And right now, they're only coming back 2 days a week, maybe 3, and they're having a tough time doing that. And even TriMet, earlier this year, we went and started bringing people back to work. You're seeing a lot of businesses do that because they're seeing the value of in-person work. It's just not going as fast as we had thought. and because we're still dealing with some issues. So there's a lot of work that we're doing. Our employer teams are meeting with a lot of those folks. We start selling those contracts for universal passes, like employer passes, starting in May. And that's going to be a focal point, is really to talk about the safety and security that we're doing on our system, because we're doing a lot and it is getting better. And frankly, the story is on us. It's making sure that we're telling that story out there. Now, I want to make sure we don't get ahead of our skis. We want to make sure that we are providing that safe, reliable service before we ever start promoting ourselves. So it's kind of that chicken and the egg that we're in right now, but we're almost there, and we're feeling very confident about that. I would note that the fare increase, you talked about all of those folks who use our system right now, and before the pandemic, we saw such a huge level of choice riders. People had those 2 cars at home that were using our system all the time. And then when the pandemic hit, we were really using our service to help people, essential workers, get to our service. So it really opened up our eyes around that. I would say for all those people who are using our service, if they're using it every day, they will not be affected by this fare increase. It's going to be those one-offs that the fare increase will actually be affecting. All those people that we're trying to get back on the system for employers, whether they're small or large, they won't be affected either. So it's really those one-offs that this fare increase will really affect.
Dr. Gonzalez, did you have any additional questions? No. Okay.
No. Thank you.
So thank you so very much, and now we'll move on to welcome John Gardner, and is it Jake War from Espousal for preliminary report on the Title VI. Welcome.
Thank you, President Simmons, and good morning, Board. And I'll introduce Jake War a little fully later as we get into the presentation.
Okay.
But thank you again to have some time to talk to you through TriMet's preliminary Title VI program analysis. Next slide. So this morning, I'm going to give a little bit of background on our fare increase history, some of the public outreach that you all heard about last week. That is a required element of our Title VI program. That Jake will walk you through the initial Title VI findings. This is the highlights of the findings. You'll receive the full report ahead of April's board meeting. And then we'll have a break, and then we'll come back and talk about mitigations. Okay. Next slide.
Okay.
So I think this is really important to understand, and it actually came to mind, this information about our history and our planning around a fare increase based on a conversation I had with a TIAC member in December who was new to TIAC, but thought that this idea of a fare increase was coming out of nowhere once the board made the announcement for us to pursue the conversation. And so I thought it would be helpful to give you all just a recount of the formal or the communication we've had around a fare increase over the last 7 years. So in 2017, as part of our first business plan, we articulated a need for a fare increase and to maintain acceptable fare box recovery to optimize the balance of service demands, revenue, and cost. So essentially, over the last 6 years, in every business plan, we have articulated the need for a fare increase plan or a key strategic action around raising fares. In 2019, we actually articulated the need to do a 10-cent increase every other year. And these business plans, of course, are shared with TIAC and CAT on an annual basis before they come to you. So we have been communicating the need for a fare increase or a higher fare box recovery rate for the last 7 years. And one of the outliers, of course, was when we launched the reduced fare program, the only way we were able to do that and not have a cost and offset and loss of service was because we were using state external funds. And all of our subsidy programs are essentially funded with external resources. So we wanted to make sure folks know in 2018, 19, 21, and 22, and even now, we are coming to you to tell you how important fares are to our infrastructure and our services and communicating that need both in this form, but also in the business plan. So we have quite a strong record of making sure folks understand it's part of our lifeblood. Next slide. So I think Nancy did a great job of articulating how fares support service, and that TriMet has, for the last 4 years, been operating at a fare deficit. Again, she walked you through how our table of service is made whole by our grants, our federal formula dollars, are fares and taxes. But of course, if fares are not keeping up, that table is wobbly, and that's kind of where we're at. Many times I think the public thinks of our fares as a percentage of our budget, and so in 2018 it was about 20%, and in this year, year's budget it was 10%. All that means is that fares are not keeping pace. And fares are the most flexible resource we can use with operating. And I just wanted to go back to something Nancy said about that $1 billion worth of effort that TriMet outcompeted the other 500 transportation properties around the country to secure. Most of that is capital, which means we don't have to use fares or our operating budget to offset system growth costs. So it's a good thing. But not having the fares means we just have less flexibility. Next slide. So of course, you all know that in November you directed our team to sort of move forward with that middle road proposal. There were 3 fare strategies presented, and we went forward with the outreach on the middle strategy. And so that, of course, triggered all of our Title VI requirements, including the public outreach, which you heard that full report last week, which will also be part of our formal written report we provide you ahead of next month's meeting. Next slide. And all of these things come from the Federal Transit Administration's requirements of us as a public transit provider, which is very specific and regimented. Next slide. And this comes because we have 50 vehicles operating in our peak time. We serve a very large 3-county urbanized area. And our fare policy and the federal statutes require a Title VI analysis anytime we do a fare media change. We did this when we went from paper to the electronic fare. Regardless of the amount, whether it's $1 or a penny, we would do it. And regardless of if it's an increase or decrease. So even when we have been adding our subsidies programs, including the reduced fare program, we did a Title VI fare analysis to make sure that it's providing the burdens that the benefits that we hope it would be. And of course, all of this has to be done before you vote. And so when you vote, when you get your first reading, we will be submitting a final Title VI analysis subject to any sort of additional mitigations you might consider. So to walk you through our findings and what the research we have and what it's showing us, we are blessed here, next slide, to work with Jake War. A little bit of background about Jake War, who's Director of Policy and Planning for Espousal Strategies. Jake was actually a TriMet employee back in 2015, charged with leading our Title VI efforts. So he's quite familiar with our Title VI analysis for both service, fares, and complaint management. So I consider him an expert in this field, and we were very lucky to have him, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you, Jake.
Thanks, John, and good morning, President Simmons, members of the board. Yeah, as John mentioned, I was at TriMet years ago, and so it's good to see some familiar faces around. And I was lucky enough during that time that there weren't any fare increases, and it was service improvements. So this is a little bit more of a difficult Title VI analysis, definitely. So just wanted to review the policy that TriMet has in place around analyzing fare increases or fare changes through the Title VI lens. And it's really looking at potential disproportionate impacts on minority and low-income riders. So I'll note that, of course, an equity analysis broadly would look at more than people of color and low-income riders. It would look at people with disabilities, it would look at age, et cetera. Title VI is a little narrower, and I'll also note that the terminology, minority, low income, those are from the FTA circular, so that's what I'm relying on here just to be consistent with that. So the adopted policy, stay on that slide really quick. So the adopted policy that you approved in your Title VI plan is that when evaluating fare increases, if the protected population, minority or low income, is adversely affected by 10% or more than their counterparts, so that would be considered disparate impact when we're talking about minority riders or populations, or disproportionate burden when we're talking about low income. So next slide, please. So the first step of looking at this fare increase and how and who would be impacted, we sorted folks into different rider categories based on the type of fare payment they use and how frequently they ride. And then assessed kind of what the level of impact would be based on that. So as John mentioned, you know, it's a 12%. I think you mentioned it's a 12% increase on the single fares for both the adult fare from $250 to $280, as well as the honored citizen, youth, and low income fares, just go to $125 to $140. So it's a similar percentage, but a mitigating factor, of course, for HOP users is that the cap would not change. So those riding frequently would not see a huge increase, or would not see an increase at all in their monthly transportation costs. However, those who have not adopted the HOP Fast Pass yet, those who are tapping on board with credit card or mobile wallet, or using cash, those folks are going to see a 12% increase without any sort of mitigating factor of the cap. So those are the most impacted riders. Second to that are those who are less frequent but are using HOP. So they are not reaching the fare cap. So they are also seeing a 12% increase in their monthly transportation costs. However, they do have the opportunity, those particularly who are close to reaching the cap on a monthly basis, to take advantage of that. So some might actually take additional rides to reach that cap and then be able to ride the rest of the month without additional cost. As I mentioned, those who ride most frequently currently reaching the cap, little to no impact. The one potential impact is that they would need to pay that full monthly amount, $100 or $28, depending on the fare, in fewer days. So that could have a small impact. And then other fare payers of other types should not be impacted by the increase. So then looking at potential disproportionalities, there were really two sources of data for this. There's the Planning Future Transit Survey that TriMet conducted in 2022, and then the survey around this specific fare increase that was just conducted. And so on this first piece of the analysis, it's using that Planning Future Transit Survey, looking at fare payment type and who falls into those categories based on ridership. So if we're looking at the threshold, that 10% threshold, the one that stands out is that minority riders, a greater percentage, by 13% of minority riders use cash or credit on board to pay their fares. So they fall into that highest impact category. The other categories of riders did not meet that 10% policy threshold. And if you note that 17%, you might say, well, that's greater than 10% on the second highest. But that's actually the percentage is higher for the non-minority riders. If that was flipped, that could also be a potential disparate impact. Next slide, please. So the second part of the analysis, and this was something that I actually have not seen that I think is TriMet should be lauded for, is in surveying folks about potential impacts, you just asked directly whether folks would be impacted and how large of an impact they expect it to be. So when we're looking at the responses to that survey by minority riders, those expecting a large impact did meet that 10% threshold. So 47% of minority riders surveyed said they expect a large impact from this increase, compared to 35% of non-minority riders. So that does hit that 10% threshold. So we flagged that for disparate impact as well. However, I will note that when asked whether they would take fewer trips, it was a more similar percentage between minority and non-minority riders, so it did not meet that threshold. So in summary, the findings from that disparate impact analysis, the analysis does find that the fare increase would have a disparate impact on minority riders, again, indicated by those who pay cash or credit, and those who report that they expect to experience a large impact as a result. Next slide. So then the disproportionate burden analysis on low-income riders. Here, as I walked through before, sorted into fare categories and ridership levels. None of these met quite the 10% threshold that is the TriMet policy. However, I will note that in both cash or credit users, it's close to that threshold. So we do have a higher percentage of low-income riders paying using cash or credit card on board. It's 9% greater, so it's certainly a difference. It just doesn't quite hit that 10%. Similarly, with those less frequent HOP users who were low income, it's an 8% difference, not quite the 10%, but so certainly worth noting, but just not meeting the policy threshold. Next slide. So in that first analysis, that did not find a disproportionate burden. As I mentioned, it's less than that 10% threshold for the most impacted and second most impacted groups. But then going to the survey, asking directly about expected impact, across the board, we see that low-income riders expect to be impacted, both generally, a large impact, and they expect to take fewer trips as a result of the increase. Those all hit that 10% or more threshold, and so as a result of that analysis, we find a disproportionate burden on low-income riders. So, in summary, the analysis did find both a disparate impact on minority riders, a disproportionate burden on low-income riders, which calls for avoiding, minimizing, or mitigating those impacts, which John is going to speak to. I will reiterate the monthly fare caps and the low-income or reduced fare program and youth pass. Those are crucial mitigating factors that really imply opportunities to move folks into that highest impacted category down to less of an impact by encouraging HOP adoption and also increasing awareness and enrollment in the reduced fare programs. There are gaps between both minority riders and riders who don't speak English as a first language in terms of HOP adoption and awareness of the low-income fare program. And so those are important considerations for targeting marketing efforts, communications, et cetera, to try to close these gaps and reduce some of those potential impacts.
Let's take the screen down and look to our virtual board members as well as our in-person board members and see if there are any questions before we take a break. I don't see Director Bauman. Could we take me off the screen? And there she is. Director Gonzalez.
Thank you. Appreciate the presentation. Not sure if this was in part of the Title VI analysis or if this was addressed in the financial forecasting, but I imagine it's in there somewhere. Who's hitting the cap? That's what I'd really like to know. I'm operating under the assumption. Can you hear me okay? I'm seeing confused faces.
No, yeah.
Okay, who is hitting the cap? I know that for honored citizens and low-income fare riders, the monthly cap is $28 compared to $100. So that's about almost a 4x difference. But the difference in fares is 50%. So low income pays half of what the normal standard adult fare. So I would assume that the low income fare riders are hitting the cap at twice the rate of fare riders, assuming it takes half as many rides as a low-income fare person to hit the cap as it would for an adult fare rider. But is that true? Are we seeing fare riders and honor citizens hitting the cap at twice the rate of the standard fare? Or how reachable are caps group right profile?
So I think the most recent data I've seen from our fare team is showing some summer data that had about 66% of all riders meeting the cap, and our balance is about 50%, 51% of the ridership is low income. it did seem like a higher percentage. I wouldn't say twice. I would say more like 67 versus 64%. So 67% in the month of August, or in the 3-month period, we're hitting the cap. But I think Jake's right. There's so much work and opportunity for first getting folks enrolled in the program and using HOP, and then reminding people, and this is Jake's language, tap, tap, cap. Because what we're seeing is people are forgetting to tap even if they have reached the cap or not. So there's a lot of opportunity there. But and I think even in that snapshot from last summer, there's a lot of 36% growth, so people can get the full benefits.
And I would add that that was kind of the goal of the analysis, was to look at who is riding more frequently and therefore reaching the cap. Kind of imperfect data as far as we don't know exactly the number of trips, so sorted into frequent riders, regular, occasional, and infrequent, that don't have specific numbers tied to them as far as how many trips and therefore whether they're reaching the cap by fare type. Actually looked early on in this work at the fare survey in 2018 that did ask about number of trips per week, but realized 2018 today, that's certainly a whole different context in so many ways, and so did the best we could to kind of get to that with what we have.
Right. Director Bauman.
Yes, thank you. I enjoyed the presentation. That was a lot to take in. You know, my recollection is that when we get reports, when the board receives reports about the use of hop cards, we hear that it's, you know, great market penetration, I guess. I seem to recall something like in the 80% or more of riders are using hop cards. And so I was surprised to see this in your analysis of what looked like a relatively large percentage of folks saying they don't use hop cards. Is that self-reported, or does that come from our own data?
From what I used, it was self-reported from the surveys.
I see. Okay, there seems like a disconnect. Maybe others don't. Maybe they can be reconciled, but.
And I think the disconnect came from the 85% numbers you're hearing in the fare presentations are fares collected, but we went very deep into our community-based organization partnerships, and and you can even see this report tells you that we need to do a better job with minorities and low-income riders. Well, that's who our community partners serve, and that's the majority of the survey respondents. So it's skewing the data a little bit, but it's also showing us where there's the greatest opportunity.
Any further questions, Director Bauman?
No, that's all that I had. Thank you.
Any other, Director Lewis?
Just a quick question on the hop card. Is it in other languages or just English only? I was just curious.
If you go to the HOP site, there is the HOP program is translated, and we're launching some new software even in the next few months. Hopefully, that will translate into all of our 13 languages, or 7 to 13 languages.
But you only see the language if you have computer and go online. The card itself is in English.
Yeah, yes, the card is in English. Our 42 community-based registration sites provide multiple languages and how to write training, so that's how we sort of support that group.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? Director Wei?
I'm sorry, thank you. I do have a clarifying question. So I think it was slide 10 where it was a chart on the writer categories and impacts. And I'm just wondering why youth or students weren't listed in writer category, because there is a proposed increase of 15 cents.
Yeah, in this case, the survey data that was available did not have the fare type. It had the fare medium, so it had HOP versus cash credit. So that layer wasn't available. It was simply a data limitation there. But yeah, you're correct in that, especially that folks who have the youth pass or have honored citizen, et cetera, I mean, they don't need to ride as frequently to reach the cap. again, we don't quite have that level of detail to say who is and who's not reaching the cap and what type of fare by how frequently they ride using that survey data.
Wouldn't that data be important to just continue our equity analysis work? I just imagine as young people are, but they're a significant demographic that is using our system. I would argue that a lot of them are also identifying as youth of color, low income.
Yeah, certainly. And I think part of the challenge with these surveys, they're different than kind of the onboard fare surveys that TriMet has done in the past, and maybe John can speak to that. But
yeah, and I think in going back to the sort of the schedule of activity, we were planning to do the onboard fare survey, person to person, but of course the pandemic did not allow for that kind of contact. I would say that we don't look, Title VI doesn't look at youth, they look at poor or minority. So we are capturing them within those contexts. Just like Jake said earlier, we don't look at individuals with disabilities, we look at, are you poor or minority? That's the expectation for the Title VI review. We do usually collect a lot of that other information in our just normal outreach.
Yeah, I think I would just, there's the bare minimum, right, that Title VI allows by federal law agencies to follow. So I'm glad that we're, doing the standard, right, of level of analysis. But I think as a transit agency, and particularly just the comment that I'm making around if we're trying to increase the youth pass, I think we can go a little bit above and beyond just, what the federal government requires us to do, and include more youth data or youth data into this picture. Because as a board member, I would want to make the most informed decision as I can with this fare increase and see how all these different populations would be impacted.
Director Wei, I think that's a great comment. I would definitely say this is above and beyond. It doesn't reach every population, but it reflects that. And the questions we asked and using the surveys we did are more than just asking the one question for each of the populations. So, but I think you're right. When we can do more, we should.
Great, thanks.
Okay, Director Edwards.
That was part of my question, I guess, as well, in regard to trying to capture those that are not low income and are not minorities, and being able to capture that information because they're impacted as well. Those that have accessibility issues. When I looked at this number too, the 10%, that was forecasted for last year, that I'm sure they had to take into consideration that the ridership has been down. And so even if we increase the fare and the ridership goes down, what are the assumptions going to look like in regards to the percentage, of the budget? That's
right. And I think Nancy answered that question, and so did JC, from the standpoint of the projections of Ford Together compensate, and they include the rider recovery strategies. And so that 110 million rides, I think over the next 7 years, is showing that we believe we can regain that ridership through that Forward Together plan, taking in all these factors into consideration. But it also assumes that we have fair revenue to cover the cost of that expanded system, which I think was mentioned earlier. Over the last 10 years, we're providing 14% more service than we did 10 years ago, but our costs are the same. So, but I think if you dive back into the rider recovery strategy within the Forward Together plan, you'll see that it's not relying on going downtown. It really is supporting people where they live and the communities in which they travel, which is in Hillsborough and Tigard and Tualatin and Gresham, and as well as downtown Portland, but that's not what it's reliant on.
JC.
I just wanted to add into, we historically have seen ridership losses after a fare increase, just being very honest. In fact, it's actually forecasted. Nancy and her team look at that, but in the past it has also come back. So while people may say that they will ride less, of course they're answering an emotional question at the moment, we do see riders return. So that while it's a consideration, it's not one that we feel is insurmountable.
I guess my concern is that there's many mitigating factors, and a lot of them are out of our control. We've got crime that's on the increase. We have homelessness that's on the increase. It's not being addressed as well. And, that that, along with the fare increase, I think is really hard to measure when it comes to having a reduction in the income that we're going to receive from the fare increase.
Okay, I think it's time for a break. So let's take at least a 10-minute break and come back at about 10:22. That I can't keep time very well. I said 10 minutes and it's been beyond that, so I do apologize to everyone for the being tardy. And I think we are looking forward to having Mr. Gardner. And I don't know if you want Jake at this next session or, okay. So welcome back. Now we're going to go into the part of the program where John Gardner will be going over mitigations to fare increases and just mitigations to fare in general. Welcome back.
Thank you again, President Simmons and members of the board. So yeah, now is the more fun part of the conversation where we get to talk about, based on the findings, what types of mitigations or actions can we take to sort of minimize the impacts of the fare increase where possible. So before we sort of dive into new initiatives or activities, I wanted us to get grounded in what we currently do. So I think everybody's aware of the low income or the reduced fare program. Hopefully folks understand what we're doing on the summer pass program, which is going into its second year this year. What we've launched in the last year in partnership with CAT to provide even more free fare grants to seniors and individuals with disabilities and veterans. And what we do in our school year-round program and just so many other efforts. But I think it's helpful to maybe quantify that for you all in terms of what we've invested. And next slide. So over the last, I think, and Jake's a good watermark. So when I came to TriMet in 2015, and Jake and the team in TriMet and the previous board had instituted a series of subsidized programs. They had a grant program and a discount program of about $1.2 million a year. So over the course of the last 7 years, TriMet has invested over $30 million in subsidized new fare programs. The vast majority of that coming from the HB 217 state planning resources, but a lot of those program elements and ideas came from CAT and TIAC. So you should feel very good in terms of what we're currently doing, especially when it comes to youth and individuals with disabilities. I mean, this year we are estimating to be able to provide 35,000 young people with free summer passes. So if we would to do the assessment of the fare impacts, we'd have to include that, as well as our school round program and the fact that Portland Public School, essentially students travel for free on public transit. I did want to say that we do know, when we did all the survey work that informed the Title VI analysis, we do have breakouts of how seniors or individuals with disabilities responded, as well as youth. So we do have their voice. And the mitigations we're proposing are a reflection of everything we've heard over the last 4 months, even some of the 3,000 verbatim responses people sent to us directly. But again, in terms of what we've been doing in terms of investing to buy down and subsidize the cost of fare, as you can see at a glance, it's fairly immense. And we're very proud of this, and this is all planned to continue. Next slide.
John?
Yes.
Something that isn't captured, obviously in that last slide is just looking at the most recent allocation of STIF funds for student seniors. And I'm aware of the low-income fare program. Just for those 2 years, it's going to be $29 million has been allocated for the low-income fare program, up from $18 million the prior 2 years. So that's an example of a real commitment on the part of TriMet to have the resources if people qualify to be able to provide them that relief.
Correct, and it's not just an example of the commitment, it's a reflection of Director Way's comments that we see ridership returning, and so we expect to spend more because we believe we'll have more riders, especially young people and low-income riders over the next 2 years.
Thank you.
Great point. So when it comes to mitigation, the federal statutes are incredibly clear. We need to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the impacts of any potential disparate impacts or disproportionate burdens. So when the TriMet board approves the proposed fare increase, our team and our community partners, both our partners in CAT and TIAC and others, will help us develop and operationalize the mitigations we're planning to move forward. Next slide. So the first premise is that we are not raising the monthly pass cost or the monthly fare caps cost. We will not raise cap cost on honored citizens, youth, adults, reduced fare, any of our subsidized programs, as well as just a daily fare. We do have charts that you'll see in the Title VI program that shows how many days sooner people will actually qualify those. Essentially, it's from 13 days to 10 days. It's all it's going to take you if you're in one of those subsidized programs, or 24 days to 20 days in the adult program. So as Jake said, there's a slight burden, but you're actually getting the benefit of that fare cap much sooner because of the fare increase. The other thing we're not going to be doing is we're not raising fares to the federal approved level for paratransit riders. Right now, the federal government assumes we're charging paratransit Lyft riders twice our adult fare, so that would be $5. Currently, we're only charging them $2.50. So even though there's a projected fare increase for them, it will still be half of the federally standard rate. Next slide. The other thing you heard, and I think this was reflected in sort of some of the findings of the Title VI report, was there's a ton of opportunity to expand access and registration and participation in our reduced fare programs, and essentially all of our subsidy efforts. And if we do that alone, we could potentially reduce any of the impacts of the findings of the Title VI report. But we also think there are things we can do, like currently when you sign up for the reduced fare program, you get 2 years of eligibility. We want to move that in alignment with Honored Citizen and make it 3 years. And we want to work to expand the HOP retail network so you can get access to fares, HOP cards, and loading fares at even more locations across the 3-county area. So these are the high level. There's a ton of sub-strategies, and when you see the Title VI report, you'll see other ideas that aren't mitigations, but they're steps that we think we can do to sort of increase access and reduce the impacts of the fare increase. But we wanted to put these in front of you this morning to get your feedback and your thoughts.
Okay. Director Gonzalez.
Thank you, President Simmons. On the previous slide, you made mention, John, of the no changes to caps, to any version of capping. And I heard you mention that the daily rate is not the cap to the daily rate is not changing. So I wanted to just make sure I understood that clearly for the sake of myself, fellow board members, and the public. So if I understand it correctly, in today's system, I will be capped at $5 in a day. So if I ride 2 times, I'm gonna spend $5. And if I ride 3 times, I'm gonna spend $5 that day. Now, if we raise the rates by 30 cents, I'm still paying $5 if I ride it twice in one day.
No, and
Is that-
no, that's sorry. And if I misspoke, my apologies, Director Gonzalez. The daily cap, the single-use fare increases and the daily cap increases, but the monthly cap doesn't increase. So if you ride 3 times or 4 times, you'll be spending $5.60 or $2.80 per day until you reach the cap, and then there's no cost to you. So the single fare ride increase would be 15 to 30 cents, and the daily would be 30 to 60 cents. So yes, daily caps increase, but not the monthly cap.
I'm looking to see if,
Verification. I wanted to make sure I understood.
okay. I'm looking to see if there are any other questions. Director Way.
Thank you, John, for this overview. I do have a question. So, again, in our current proposal, we have an increase to the youth. Sorry, there's a lot of pages here. But we have an increase to the youth. I think it was a 15-cent increase. And then, I think through the efforts that you mentioned with our partnerships with state dollars, we do have current programs that essentially help pay for young folks to take transit. So I guess I'm trying to understand, why is it again that we are still raising the youth fare if we have programs that already minimize those costs?
I believe the short answer is to offset the loss of revenue that would prevent us from expanding service. So right now we have an option for any school district to sort of buy into TriMet service as opposed to pay transportation dollars to other strategies. Portland Public is the primary user of that opportunity. So during the school year, their youth travel for free. And we also have made some great gains in East County with Park Rose. So they also decided it was a better investment for them to buy passes for their students. And then beyond that, we do use some state funds to provide transportation grants to all 17 school districts. So there's a lot of opportunity for students who are struggling to find transportation support within their school, high school, or school district. And one of the things we want to do that's a sub-strategy is really work with those partners to do a better job disseminating that information so parents or students can get access to the fares that are out there today. Last year, some of our high schools didn't actually spend down their grants that we've given them. So before we add more, we want to make sure we're leveraging and using what we have available.
Got it. Okay.
And I guess maybe the other thing is as we increase service, that service cost is increased for everybody, youth, adult, any user of the system. And increasing fares just allows us to support that cost of increased service.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to noodle on that a little bit more. There's a lot of information that we just received, so I'm just processing. Thanks.
Director Bauman?
Thank you. On this slide, there's reference to expanding the HOP retail network. I remember when the HOP program was adopted several years ago, and at that time, the number of retail outlets that were expected to sell HOP cards was enormous. It was 500, some really large number. Has there been some retrenchment on that? We in our one of the slides when we had a presentation last week, there was something about certain stores no longer selling HOP cards. What's happening with the availability of HOP cards in those sort of smaller, neighborhood markets and so on?
A great question, Director Bauman. So yes, we have seen a reduction in the amount of retail providers of the HOP card. Mostly, as you've seen, businesses close, small family-owned businesses close. A lot of those are stores. There's just not the traffic for them. And so some of the things we're talking about doing is working more with community-based organizations so they can load fares. Right, so that alone would add dozens, if not hundreds, of locations for folks to actually load fares to their cards or get access to cards. And Sophia Milletz is actually building another strategy to maybe invest more into retail networks, especially culturally specific retail stores, that it actually makes cost sense for them to provide it. Because what we would rather have if they don't have a lot of traffic is still have the ability to sell and load fares. And so that's, we believe with a little bit more investment, we can actually expand the retail network.
That means what, creating incentives or lowering the cost for them to sell HOP cards?
Exactly, both and.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Director Gonzalez, and then Director Edwards.
Thank you, President Simmons. A quick question and then a comment. I'll start with the question. What is the low-income fare qualification threshold? Are we basing it on AMI? Are we following a federal line? Could you clarify that, please?
Yes, currently, if you're at 200% the federal poverty level, you are qualified for the reduced fare program. We also have other qualifiers, automatic qualifiers. If you're participating in Section 8, if you're a TANF recipient, if you're in the Oregon Health Plan, if you're receiving Medicaid or Medicare, you're you automatically are eligible. And we do self-assessment, so we're not asking you to completely document all your private information. And so we're working with a lot of the state governments, Department of Human Services, and others to sort of spread that word. And of course, I think President Simmons mentioned at the last board meeting that the federal poverty rate has gone up, so even more people are now qualified. So when we talk about expanding registration and participation, we know we have to do more marketing and outreach to make sure people know that they now may actually qualify, which maybe 2 or 3 years ago they didn't.
And although although we talk about low-income fare, when we talk about honored citizen, there's a different qualifier, which has to do with age, right? And so, I mean, there are a number of people who get the same fare as low income, but there are different kinds of criteria.
Right, age or disability.
Right.
Sorry, Director Gonzalez, you had more?
Oh, no, thank you. Yes, can you please translate that for us, 200% below the federal poverty line? Do you know what that translates today in annual dollars earned by an individual?
I'm going to be wrong, but I believe it is around 44,000 for a family of 4, but someone could, 50,000 for a family of 4.
Thank you, that helps a lot. So now onto a comment. Going back to a question raised by Director Way around the youth passes, you said something that kind of prompted an idea in my mind. If we are essentially subsidizing the youth passes on behalf of youth, so that a youth is being paid, if the youth fare is being paid by the school or by the STIF dollars or some other mechanism, but not by the youth directly, why don't we increase the price of the youth pass so that we can utilize those dollars and draw those dollars more directly as a rider, encouraging the youth to have a youth pass that is 100% subsidized anyway?
That's a good point. What I would first say is we're not actually subsidizing the cost of youth ridership. When we did the math, there's about 85,000 youth in our region. So even this summer, the subsidized summer pass program is only able to support about 35, maybe 40,000 youth. So the assumption is that those youth are the most transit dependent and most likely low income, right? So there is a focus with the resources we have. So even the resources we have through this initiative and the year round are not enough to actually support the cost of youth. But you are correct, Director Gonzalez, that as prices increase, that subsidy is something that we look to get, not from that subsidy is available to sort of build towards, I guess. So, but I would say it's not a fully subsidized program, but it does, I think, put a dent into the need for transit supports for youth.
Right, right. Director Edwards.
Good morning again, John. My question is, what is the requirements? I think I know, but what are the requirements for an honored citizen fare?
Honored citizen is you're eligible based on age and or a disability. And so one of the exciting things about launching the reduced fare program in 2018, as we talk to people about the honored citizen program now allowing income, we actually have seen quite a large increase in enrollment in the honored citizen of seniors and individuals with disability. Because it's once you're generally in that, you do not de-age, so your eligibility is always there, and you secure that discount for as long as you need it for using the program.
I guess I would like to see some kind of a breakdown of who our honored citizens are and what would be the projections going forward on that, as well as if we did an analysis of perhaps a even further reduced fare for someone that met more than one qualification of being an honored citizen.
Okay, we can definitely, before the April board meeting, show you analysis of all the demographics by subsidized program. And we can show you, which I mentioned earlier, but I think we should show you, and I think this came up, just the difference in how much we charge for paratransit versus other properties, and how deep our discounts are compared to other like systems.
Right.
It just seems fair to me, if I meet more than one qualification, I should get a reduced fare even further.
Well, and I think everybody saw Kat's presentation, or Kat came to last week's board meeting, and I know that General Manager DeJesu and I are looking forward to meeting with Kat to understand some of their ideas and potentially incorporate some of those into, if not the mitigation, certainly in next year's business plan.
And because I think that once we get that information, that'll help us have more information to make a decision. I think that would be very helpful.
I appreciate the direction.
One of the things that I'll point out to the full board that may not be aware of is that within state statute, it actually defines that the fare for individuals, seniors and others needs to be 50% of whatever. And so, I didn't realize it was actually written into statute, because at one point, some of us were talking about, just because of age, does that mean that that you don't have the resources to pay for fare? But yet, we don't have the option, because it's in state statute, that it has to be a reduced fare. Interesting when you read the law. Other questions? Director Bauman, do you have another question?
Yes, I do have another question. I want to pick up on the honored citizen fare and ask you a question directly about the LIFT or the paratransit program. I'm familiar with the honored citizen program insofar as people with disabilities qualifying for the half-price fare. I'm not as familiar with how riders are charged for Lyft services, and it seems that in recent months we had some testimony suggesting that there's not a break basically if you're an honored citizen and you ride Lyft. Is that right? I assume that a lot of the riders of the Lyft program are honored citizens. Do they pay the half price fare on Lyft?
That's a great question, Director Bauman, and I think that goes back to the second sort of mitigation is that the federal government generally assumes transit providers are charging twice the adult fare for paratransit rides. So in our region, that would be $5 per ride. What previous boards have instituted is actually we would charge less. That's not a statute. That's an organizational decision recognizing that individuals that require paratransit transportation probably are in a different position of payment. So we are actually providing a 50% discount to the assumed cost of transportation. So it should be $5 per ride. We're charging $2.50 per ride. So they are getting a benefit to that. And even in the proposed fare increase, they would still be getting that 50% benefit off the cost of sort of the federal assumed rate. But we will show you those tables in terms of how we compare with other paratransit services and properties before the next meeting.
Yeah, I think.
Okay, thank you. But can I just clarify? So I'm an honored citizen. I have an honored citizen pass. I'm riding on Lyft. I pay currently $2.50. I don't pay the $1.25. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. You would only pay the $1.25 if you use fixed route services.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Director Edwards and then Director Lewis.
I just want to point out too that Lyft is point to point, and that's wonderful. But there's some other issues that are involved with that I don't want to discuss here and now. But issues that make that not the same as when you're riding on a fixed route bus or on the high-speed transit as well.
Director Lewis?
Thank you. Director, for John, again, when you prepare the data that Director Edwards had mentioned on the demographics, will that include, for the reduced fares compared to total riders, and then will it be in the different demographics such as our area?
You mean within the district?
Can you elaborate more on those numbers again? Because you were going to show the reduced fares, but in relation to total riders of that area. I don't know if it's broken down, but that would be good to see.
I don't think we have information on where our riders reside, do we?
We have some. We have some demographics.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
We will provide you the demographics we have. We do have stronger demographics for anyone who registers their HOP card and then answers those questions. And so we do know, for example, the reduced fare program is more diverse than our general ridership. So we can definitely provide you what we've collected, Dr. Lewis.
But it'll be from historical, not from the surveys and things you just did. It's just
Right, which actually might be better because it's self-disclosed people, and I think Wes Charlie, the manager of the reduced fare program, we actually have it for that program for 5 years, so we can show.
Okay.
Yep.
That would be good to see. Thanks. Thank you.
Director Way?
Thank you. I'm sorry if I didn't maybe bring this up when Nancy, you were doing your presentation, but I'm just trying to wrap my head around the overall numbers. So what is the shortfall right now? I know that there was a chart of fare revenue, and how much do we need for fares in order to make up for, the deficit? And I ask that because, I think it's important just for us to know, right, what is that number that we're trying to work towards? And then B, I think, John, to just your point around, the fare mitigation. So if we deploy all these strategies to help, these particular populations with their fares, how much of that is like a savings, I guess, if that makes sense? Because right now I think the strategies are great, but I'm just not seeing the dollars that are connected with how much is TriMet reabsorbing those costs, if that makes sense. So it's more of like a dollars and a cents question around just the overall picture of the fare increase and what's the shortfall that we're trying to make up?
Great. So, Director Wade, thank you for the question. I appreciate it. When we spoke to you in May, right, we presented to you that starting in fiscal year 2030, that we would start to see that financial cliff. So in 2030, it was 66 million. In 2031, another 23 million. 2032, 11 million. 2033, 10 million. So the cumulative, right, is 365 million. As I mentioned earlier, we've gotten a little bit more aggressive in our projections on the employer payroll tax. We've added in the 30-cent fare increase. So we can pull that, push that out a couple of years, but we are still looking at close to 100 million in a deficit that we are trying to bridge. And that will be, we continue to take cost-cutting measures, right? Being very mindful of our day-to-day spending year over year. We had talked in in November, that TriMet has purposely increased our unrestricted ending fund balance to anticipate those future shortfalls. So we have been very prudent, very, very wise with our spending to ensure that, that we are managing that shortfall that we will face. Does that answer your question, Director Quinn?
And I think
Yes.
the other part of your question, if I understood it, so as President Simmons said, the HB 217 plan calls for $29 million is an essentially subsidy, right? So $15 million next year to support the reduced fare program, the summer pass program, and a lot of the grant programs you've heard. So that is state subsidy, so it's not adding to our shortfall, but without that, we would not be able to provide all those programs. So if you increase the participation of those programs, at some point, we'll have even greater shortfalls, so.
Right.
Okay.
Beyond the resources that
Right.
are allocated.
So the total is $66 million
In 1 year.
for 1 year,
In
right?
1 year, right?
Right.
So,
Okay.
so even with the more optimistic employer payroll tax growth, along with a fare increase, while we can push that shortfall out and we start seeing around 100 million, keep in mind, that's just 1 year. So then you
Yeah.
have to address the next year and the next year and the next year. So we're working to close that gap. And it comes not just from raising our fares, but also looking at all of those other sources that we talked about earlier today, being very competitive with those discretionary grants, looking at our employer payroll tax, the employee payroll tax, our federal, state, and local operating grant opportunities.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. And then, John, so again, I'm just trying to connect all of these pieces together so that it makes sense for me. And then when you're talking about the fare mitigation strategies, it would just be helpful for me to know, again, what would be the savings, right? I don't know if it's savings the right word or the subsidy is the right word, if we're trying to minimize the impact that the fare proposal is going to make on XYZ communities.
Certainly. So the primary savings, I think, is for a low-income individual who, if we expand the reduced fare program and we enroll them, instead of paying approximately $1,100 a year, they'll pay $328 a year. So that individual now has $700+ in buying power for groceries and the cost of living. So that person, and we can do that up to 45,000 active riders, give or take, right? So those are the savings that the states and the HB 217 allows us to subsidize. And obviously,
Okay,
that
I
could
see.
be applied to the youth in the summer pass, right? So we're saving 30,000 youth $100 in summer pass fares, or $74, 3 months of fares, right? So
Yeah.
just apply the subsidy by population, and you'll get the actual savings that person or that group will experience.
I think that explanation is great. Can we just have that written down somewhere? Maybe it's like an additional slide or just an addendum to this, because what I'm trying to wrap my head around is the financial impact, right? So the financial impact of not doing the fare increase is this, the financial impact of us raising fares is this, and then the mitigation strategy that you've proposed, the financial impacts looks like this. So I guess for me, that would be helpful, just to see what all the dollars kind of equate to.
Well, and the low-income fare program, the individual would pay an additional, let's see, they pay 125, they'd pay additional 15 cents on their fare, right?
Right.
So there is a cost to the individual. The subsidy is what covers the full cost between the 140 and the 280, right?
No,
No.
and so I think we're confusing different things, I think.
Okay.
So we have a proposed fare increase that's across the system, right? And the way to avoid actually seeing any increase is to ride. And if you ride 10, twice
I
a day
see.
for 10
Okay.
days, you cap your fares. There's no actual increase.
Yeah.
So but what we're saying is we have this pool of fare subsidy programs that support every population of riders that are vulnerable that you've all described. And we're saying we're going to increase the percentage and participation of those riders so
Right.
they benefit from not just the fare capping, which is the primary mitigation, but also the existing subsidies that are externally funded. And if they weren't externally funded, we wouldn't be doing, I think, this level of subsidy.
Right.
Right. So it's a little bit of apples, oranges, and potatoes, but we can give you clarity and some data about here's what this looks like and here's how. But I wouldn't equate it to the $66 million of deficit and operating cost because it's not the same thing. It would be greater
Okay.
it would be greater if we did not have the state funds.
Got it.
Well, and I also am drawn to a comment that Nancy Young Oliver made, which is, had we been raising fare at 2% a year, our fare would be $3.05. And so when I try to think about, trying to right-size revenue to expenditures, obviously down the road, it's probably going to take more than 30 cents 1 year. But we're only looking at 1 year at this particular point. I mean, you can't recover from no increases for as many years as we haven't had an increase in just 1 year. That would be too draconian, I think, for the public and everyone to absorb. I recall at one point in our mini sessions around understanding the budget and fiscal realities of the agency of saying the longer we wait, the bigger the cost to the individual transit rider is. Had we made decisions 10 years ago and stayed with our $5 or $10 every other year, we wouldn't be having this conversation today.
Right.
Director Gonzalez.
Thank you, President Simmons. I got a couple of questions. First, are we bound by state statute with regards to the percent subsidy for youth as we are with our honored citizens?
I don't believe so, and I think that's a great question because I think it sets up sort of how fares. If you assume our fare and our costs and our operations, you should really think of the adult fare cost, and everything below the adult fare cost, except for the paratransit, is something that previous boards have instituted or asked for some sort of subsidy or less than. Right, so we're not required to provide a youth fare. We do so because previous boards, that's a value of the organization. So from a financial standpoint, we're operating at a little bit of a loss there, but we said it's okay. So I think sometimes it gets confusing. So when you start thinking about future ridership or what our fare revenue should be, it's really more about rides times the fare of the adult system, and that's what a more operational budget reality or sustainable budget plan would look like.
Let me try it another way. I'm asking if we're, much like with state statute, we're bound to subsidize 50% of honored citizens. But we cannot go to 60% or 40% without going from the state. Are we similarly bound by state statute to be at 50% subsidy for youth pass?
No, it's not in there.
And it's not state, it's federal. And right, and it's a federal discount that the FTA and folks are applying to our paratransit. Sorry, to our honored citizen. But not youth. That youth is a local decision.
A local decision.
Thank you. That helps.
Director
Because I wanted to go to the next question, and this is around, I think Nancy Young Oliver mentioned that we are not only looking at fares and how we're going to address this potential cliff we've been referring to down the road, but the payroll tax. Are we, are we relying on voters at this point for any sort of changes or proposed changes for modifications to the payroll tax structure? What I'm saying is, how are we active in addressing conversations about any modifications to payroll taxes? Or are we relying on the general public and our legislators to drive a conversation about payroll tax?
So Director Gonzalez, the finance team runs numerous forecast scenarios, including a scenario that continues the incremental increase in our employer payroll taxes. But that particular increase, that discussion and vote is really for another day. Our base modeling does not include a tax increment beyond what the board has currently approved. JC, would you like to add anything?
I would just say that we, Director Gonzalez, we have to have those conversations with folks still to come, and I would second that it's a conversation that we are not prepared to have today. I would also like to follow up on a question you had around the youth fair and why it is what it is. This board back years ago decided to pair, as we were getting ready for the implementation of the HOP system. The prior board chose to equate the Honored Citizen Fair and our youth fair at 50% of the adult fair, and so that's what we have moved forward with. It is actually in our fair code that that the youth fair will have parity with the Honored Citizen. So that's why we have that level as where we got today.
Thank you. So I appreciate that clarification. I want to emphasize, based on the public comments we've been receiving, several comments, I'd say a majority of comments we received from the public have spoken towards how we can resolve this issue by changing things in the payroll tax. And so I just wanted to emphasize that right now, we're not forecasting any policy changes at the state level to the payroll tax or how it functions or how it feeds our particular system. And I encourage voters that to bring those ideas to their House district legislators because there's going to be a legislative cycle coming up, and there's things that that were brought to TriMet as part of our fair conversation that are really statewide measures. There's multiple systems out there that would be impacted by this conversation, and I think it's wise to look at our current payroll as part of the ecosystem. But I encourage those in the public to lean into this conversation with legislators as well, because this is something that's beyond the scope of TriMet itself. And now I'll close on a quick comment. There's something that is within the scope of TriMet that I'm curious if we've considered this, or what would the process be to institute something of this nature? I know that our forecasts are just that, and when we try to forecast ridership, I appreciate that we understood that there might be an immediate drop of the emotional response to a fare change, and perhaps a rise over time as we expand system services and as people regain that faith. Considered in this getting the HOP card rolled out and expanded, any sort of promotional exercises that are going to encourage people to begin using the pass. I would suggest us we consider things like an enrollment window where for the first month or the first 3 months, the cap is lower than, is half of what it would be in the normal month, just to encourage that person to begin really getting familiar with the system and to tap multiple times when they become that first-time enrollee. Things like that, I think, are going to help us, in addition to public communications campaigns, so that our citizens know all of the qualifying criteria, and our low-income citizens know all of the qualifying.
Great points, Director Gonzalez, and we are expecting, as when we say expand again, there's a ton of sub-strategies, and there will be a large marketing campaign, and we are setting aside resources as part of that $29 million to provide a free month pass as part of the registration, which, if you do the math on that, that actually is greater than the cost increase at least for people when they first sign up for the reduced fare program and the honored citizen program. And that honored citizen benefit, Director Edwards, is a new benefit meant to sort of meet the request for even greater discounts for our honored citizens. So those things are embedded when we say expand, and I think they're going to produce really good enrollment and results for the riders.
So something, that I want to emphasize for the full board that we've heard today is that should the board go forward with an increase, in some ways we have to, number one, trust what the staff have told us about the fiscal realities of the agency. Two, we have to trust the staff that they're going to look for mitigations. Either we'll make sure the existing mitigations are working or what additional mitigations need to take place. And that three, as a board, we have to exercise our responsibility to support the staff and the agency to make sure that the resources are available to sustain this service, which is so vital to the region. And so oftentimes I think I find myself struggling between an individual who experiences cost increases and my responsibility to an agency that relies on adequate resources to be able to be a viable resource continually for the community. And so as board, we have to weigh that, our concern for individual as well as our concern just to make sure that the agency continues into perpetuity. So I mention that because I see that kind of tension and that struggle between us as individual board members. And so I think we need, I feel a sense of trust and belief in the agency personnel and the leadership to not just, throw things, make it so that it's impossible for people to continue to use this service and consider it a viable alternative. So I want to look to see if there are any other questions or comments before. Yes, Director Edwards.
I have a comment. In light of that I think the staff has done a great job in bringing us the information that we requested. I think that we were a little bit remiss in not giving them the parameters that we needed in order to make the decision. That's why we're still asking these same questions, or not same questions, but different questions. And I think that that's the fault of us not having a little bit more foresight in looking at all the factors that we're going to be weighing in making the decision.
It's a complex topic. And I'm reminded that in my tenure on the board, which exceeds some of your tenure, is that we started this conversation, I remember in September 29th of 2020, in terms of board work sessions to understand the budget realities of the organization. And we then repeatedly have had successive work sessions to understand this. It's a complex organization. It's far more complex than I think even the public understands in terms of what the cost structures are, who pays, and what it takes to actually make this agency work. I know I've been enlightened. And so some of this is each of us have had the opportunity to become enlightened over time, and some of you don't have the benefit of the years of enlightenment that I've had on the board, but it is like peeling an onion. And so I also know that until you need the information, you don't retain it. And so we've kind of stepped towards this, and we got really close to talking about a fare increase and the pandemic hit, and we backed off of that. But we knew, and I said then, we back off, it's gonna have to be bigger in the future because we're gonna have to recover what we didn't get by doing smaller increments over time. And so it's unfortunate, once you've had 6 or 8 years in the role of being a board member, you'll have a deeper understanding and appreciation, hopefully, of the complexities of this organization and understand that when staff tell us that there's a crucial need for additional resources and that this is the option that is in the strategic financial plan, that it bears us as board to take that seriously and to act. More comments before I turn it over to Director or General Manager DeSue for next steps.
Linda, if I could jump in,
Yeah.
I guess reflecting on your comments about kind of fairs and length of tenure on the board, I do know that one principle that has motivated the board in the past is to try to simplify the fair system. And John mentioned, putting the youth fair in parity with the other honored citizen fair. And I think that was part of it too, so that we didn't have lots of different fairs and fair sort of systems, but to simplify as much as possible. So that's, as I recall, that's where a lot of the motivation around, a flat fair and then 50% for those who have some kind of mitigation or break with the fair. So anyway, just wanted to throw that in as well.
Yeah. And something else that strikes me is that in a recent board meeting, we've done away with cash machines, in certain places because of the vandalism that's been taking place in it. So another reason why we really need to accelerate other forms of payment, since cash isn't an option in some of our stations any longer. Wasn't that on the east side somewhere? There were two.
That was correct.
Yeah, two is
On the east side on the Green Line.
Yeah. Director Way.
Thank you. As I'm just kind of, again, reflecting on the increase proposal that's in front of us, I can't remember if in the last couple of work sessions why, we also didn't talk about whether or not we want to just increase the adult 2.5-hour ticket, not touch any of the honored citizen or the youth or the paratransit single ride, and just solely focus on adult 2-hour ticket. I say that because if we do have a low-income program, then folks who are adults who would qualify under the low-income program could just enroll in that program. And then, again, folks who aren't low-income can just pay, right, for maybe a 60-cent increase, just hypothetically. So just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah.
I don't know if we talked about that.
We didn't, and it doesn't, although I acknowledge it's not what we're here to talk about today. This is the proposal that the staff have put together for us, and that might be another time, another day, but that's not what we're here
President Simmons, I
about
could also
today.
just note too that the reason why, because we came forward with that amount, is because laid out in fair code as adopted by our board, it spells out that the honored citizen or fare is 50%. So any changes we make to the adult fare have to be made to the youth and honored citizens. So that's why you're seeing that.
I think in terms of education, that's very important. And, I will also say that a lot of what we're seeing today, and I'm not faulting anybody, is because it's connected to other policies that are all connected to each other that maybe during my time on the board, I didn't make those policies. I never had a discussion. I never voted on it. So that's an excellent point, JC. And I also want to say that that's why it weighs heavier on me, right? Because I wasn't part of those decisions when they were made, when these fares were also connected to one another. So for example, if one thing increases, we have to also increase another population. I wasn't a part of those conversations. So it's a little bit harder for me to kind of grapple what is presented forward to me by previous board decisions.
Yeah. So seeing no other hands, I'm going to move to General Manager DeSue and ask him to go over the timeline and ramifications for the fare increase.
Thanks, John. presentation there. So President Simmons and board members, I've heard some questions that came up today that we will be following up. One about youth cost with our comparables, so we'll get that information. Also, ridership comparison between our comparables as well. We will definitely take a look at that and bring it back. And then the hop cart that is in English only, we're going to go back and verify and talk about the different languages that are taking place. So what I've heard today is a really good conversation and presentations made by staff. I am going to direct staff to assemble the formal fare increase ordinance, which will have a first reading and public hearing at the board's April 26th meeting. And then there will be a second reading and a vote that will take place on May 24th at the board meeting. The increases that are there is increase in both the adult 2.5-hour ticket and Lyft paratransit single ride ticket by 30 cents to $2.80, and increase in the honored citizen 2.5-hour ticket and youth 2.5-hour ticket by 15 cents to $1.40. We will have this information and we will be ready to present to you at our next board meeting. So I just want to verify through you and the board, President Simmons, before I have staff do this, is this what you want us to do?
Yes, and I'm going to ask that in preparing the ordinance, revisions in the ordinance, that you include a statement that future boards must consider a fare increase every year, whether they enact it or not, but at least, as I indicated in my 6 years, this is the first time that there's been a fare increase. And had I been more knowledgeable about the implications of no fare increase to operating costs sooner, I would have raised more questions. And that's part of my own naivete. And I don't want to leave it to chance for future boards to not have that conversation prior to budget development every year. I'm not saying it needs to be invoked every year, but they need to understand the implications of either doing so or not doing so, because there's a consequence regardless of what decision you make. So I ask that on behalf of the full board. It's something I felt very strongly about throughout this whole process.
I hear you, and we'll make sure we add that, and we'll have that conversation each year at the budget presentations during the budget process.
Good, thank you. And I want to thank all the board. This is not an easy decision, as I said, from a personal standpoint as well as from a business standpoint. I see it as essential, but it's not comfortable. And I didn't expect anyone in the public to actually say that they would support it, because how many times, I mean, it's unusual for an agency to say, what do you think? You know, how many increases have we experienced personally? PGE didn't ask me if I wanted to pay more. My water bill, they didn't ask me if I wanted to pay any more. And so we've at least given our public adequate notice and justification for what we're proposing, that quite frankly I've never received from any other cost increase that I've incurred. And so I want to acknowledge that. Just because we heard that people don't want to pay more doesn't mean that they don't understand the realities of running a business, and we don't just have the luxury of deciding where our revenue comes from. It's been designated by statute. So thank you very much. We're adjourned. Whoops, sorry, I didn't see your hands up. Those little hands, I'll have to have you see it from our standpoint. First of all, they fade into the background, and you really have to look closely. So, Director Lewis and Director Gonzalez.
Director, can you restate the effective date? I heard this year, September, I mean, a while back, and I just kind of passed over it. But can you because when the general manager read, he did not state the effective date.
Go ahead.
So I'm sorry. Thank you there, Director Lewis. So the formal fare increase proposal will be presented to the board as an ordinance at the April 26, 2023 board meeting. A second reading and a vote from the board on the ordinance will take place on May 24th of this year. If approved, and on the May meeting of 2023, any fare changes would take effect on January 1st of 2024.
Director Gonzalez?
Thank you, President Simmons. A closing comment, really, I think to echo some of your sentiment, President Simmons, regarding the responsibility of the board to not only be aware of the fiscal solvency, but to not shy away from important elements of it, especially the part that we do directly influence as a board, which is fares. I think it's really important for us as a board to be able to have this conversation on a regular basis and responsibly. The fact that we haven't had this conversation for many years, I think is in part the reason why we're approaching this conversation as we are today, where we're relying heavily on TriMet staff to come forward with some proposals and to try to understand in advance what our questions and our concerns and our priorities are going to be. And with Title VI and community outreach responsibilities, I really appreciate TriMet staff on walking the fine line of bringing this idea forward in a responsible way and not in a timely way, but in a responsible way now, because it's been a long time coming that we've had to have. And I think as a board, in an ideal way, we're not waiting for TriMet to come forward with their own versions of proposals, because as Director Y mentioned earlier, some of the decisions that we're walking around with today are decisions that were made by some of our predecessors on the board. And they are people much like us. We are people too, and we have the ability to bring forward policy amendments and policy proposals to address these issues. But being aware of these issues is step one. And being able to come forward with some ideas that we can propose to fellow board members and then to the staff is what will allow us to get closer to these conversations without relying heavily on TriMet alone, on staff to try to figure out, what our priorities are. But for us to be waiting for these we're playing catch up, frankly, to be able to come back to catching up with inflation, catching up with rising costs. And so even with this 30-cent raise, we're still playing catch up, frankly. So it will be responsible of us to have this conversation in subsequent years and to at least address what our options are. Now, in an ideal way, I think this is an opportunity for us to hear the resounding public concern for this, the interest in resolving this more systematically so that we don't have to revisit fare changes and essentially go through the same process of encumbering our riders directly this way. This is our chance to be innovative and come forward with ideas that are going to help close the gap of fare box recovery and be able to address this in a responsible, proactive way. I think we as board members have the luxury to be more sort of out of the box and creative on the early side, to be bringing ideas forward that might implicate some of our agency partners and that may implicate state statute. That's the luxury we have. By the time our staff comes to the table, we have to only put forward, the things that we can directly influence. And so I really appreciate the staff for being proactive, and I encourage the board to not wait for the budget review meetings to think about what we can be doing to, have a systematic and a more comprehensive solution. I thank you very much for the time and the
Thank you. So we are adjourned. Thank you so very much.